Maureen, and I want to talk with you today about voicing. For many, many years, I tried to learn how to improve my voicing product, and I was just struggling with it until finally I realized I was trying to do two things at the same time. I really believe that receptive skill and voicing ability should be practiced separately. It's very difficult to be able to voice a good product when you don't understand what the signer is signing. So today I want to talk to you about a way to practice that I believe will really improve your abilities. Now, there are 3 steps to being able to voice: understanding, telling, and saying. Understanding, of course, it involves being able to see a deaf person, understand what they're signing. That's describing itself. You understand that word. The telling part comes when you're watching, you open your mouth, you're coming out with some kind of an utterance that makes sense while you're still watching, trying to put it all together. But the product isn't pretty. Sometimes maybe you see ASL speak. Have you ever done that yourself? Kind of like, mother there, me see. Okay, so that's not a real product, that's not a voicing product, but you're saying what you're seeing. So you're getting something out of your throat, you're telling what you see while you're watching. Now what our goal is of course to be able to say, as Jean Kelly writes in her book, say it like they mean it. It's a huge chore. It's really not something that happens overnight. So I want to back up and I want to give you some tips on each of those 3 steps. The first one, understanding. My first tip is to tell you, please realize you are not going to see textbook ASL. You've learned, you might even hang around with some deaf people, your deaf people. Like you all know, that always cracks me up when people say, my deaf people sign it this way. Anyway, but language changes depending on where you live, how you grew up. Many things influence language usage. So it will help you to make a better voicing product if you understand that everything you've learned so far is just stuffed in a bag to help you with the challenge of the next visual thing you're going to see, trying to put it together to make sense. So don't shoot yourself in the foot by expecting to see something that's not there. That's tip number 1. The number 2 tip on understanding is to break your habit of linear language thinking. Most of us who grew up, all of us who grew up speaking an oral language, pump out the words in an order, and the picture that appears in the other person's head is based on the order that we put them in. And it doesn't work with visual language. I have a little reminder that I like to use, and I'm going to show it to you now. I'm going to hold up paper and ask you what you see on this paper. Now, most of you probably said, oh, I see 2. I see 2. Lots of variations of 2. But the truth is, there are no 2s on my paper. None. Why? Because 2 is a concept. You can't write down a concept. What you saw were representations that we have all agreed will represent the concept of 2. And when you begin to think about language as conceptual rather than having to be represented in a certain way, it helps you to break that habit of thinking of the order everything has to be in to be able to express a concept. Third tip is to learn to rely on visual memorization. We that are auditory people, we often overlook visual things. Right now, if I asked you, whip out a paper and a pencil and draw a Starbucks label or logo, could you do it? Now, even if you don't drink coffee, I know you have seen the Starbucks logo. It's ubiquitous. It's every place. You can't, well, maybe I overstate the case, but it's true that it's every place. Are you able to draw it from memory? Most deaf people can. So that's the kind of challenge. In a little bit, I'll show you that logo and see if you got it right. Many people are surprised, but the next time you go driving into your local Starbucks, you'll never look at that logo the same way again. But there are some tips that you can do to get along trying to learn some visual memory. Maybe you've gone to parties like Tupperware or something where they play games. You can do that. Ask someone in your house to set up 15 different items. Just go around the house, pick them up, cover them up. You then go with a little stopwatch, take the cover off for 30 seconds, look at those things, cover them up, and go try to write down what you remember seeing. You can play those kinds of games, but if you're not exercising that part of your brain, you're going to have a hard time trying to take in all this visual information. It's important to learn that skill. Now, as I told you in the beginning, I think we've been making a mistake all these years to try to practice receptive and voicing at the same time, even though we know it happens that way in real life. We know that. There's no practice for real life voicing. So in practice, go ahead and get a clip that you understand the person, and then you can actually practice the voicing part. Because I bet, even though you understand completely what the deaf signer is signing, you're still not going to be able to make a perfect voicing product. It takes a lot of practice to be able to do that. Okay, on the second step is telling, and I have about 3 tips to help you improve on that level. First, practice loudly. Often we get so timid and we're practicing, we think we see it, and we're just kind of making the words in our throat, kind of following along, making a quasi-product. Developing the habit of keeping your voice in your throat instead of projecting. So when you practice, shut the door, close the window, shades, and just my theory about practicing is, if this is where you want to be, this is perfect, and you're over here, gravity kind of keeps you down there and you make a few headways, but you come back, habit. If you will loosen up and practice way over here to the point of being ridiculous, when you come back, you'll be closer to your goal. I really like the quotes from Aristotle. We are what we repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence is not one act, it's a habit. So if you will learn to practice loudly, you're helping yourself, because later when you actually can voice, you're not trying to break the bad habit of keeping your voice in your throat. Tip number 2, try to develop some self-monitoring. Often we're hanging on for dear life and we're just letting words come out of our mouth and we forget what we just said. Classic example on this is non-gender words. So if you see the deaf signer signing about his teacher, so the voicer's like, okay, give me a little information here. Is this a woman teacher? Is this a man teacher? Same thing happens with doctor. We don't know. So if you're not given that information, you have to make a choice. You can't just keep saying, my teacher, my teacher, my teacher. So you decide on a gender and think, okay, I'll fix it later if I have to. or you could stop them in real life, but on a testing situation, you can't stop them and ask. Hopefully you wouldn't see that on a test, but anyway, if you decide to use the male gender pronoun, he, please try to remember that you use that so later on in the story, when the teacher comes up again and it's the same teacher, you don't use she. So that's kind of a self-monitoring habit that's good to develop now that will make your voicing product better as you go along. Tip 3, your voice is an instrument, and you need to realize that. Often we just think, well, it's just the words. I have to pick the right word and then I'll be successful. And that's pretty true. However, when you begin to really pay attention to how hearing people use their voice, the inflections, you can make a product that's much more interesting. I'm going to give you a practice line. If I ask you in just a monotone, repeat after me, hey sweetie, what do you need? Hey sweetie, what do you need? Great, very monotone, we don't know, we can't understand the situation. Now I'm going to give you 3 scenarios and you change your voice and see if you can recognize how your voice changes. First situation, you're chatting with a 5-year-old at a party who comes up, hands held, and you say, hey sweetie, what do you need? Right? When we're talking with kids, your voice, the pitch goes up. We're much more flowy. It sounds almost like this. Hey sweetie, what do you need? Yes. All right. Second one, if you are a gum chewing waitress at Waffle House and you're getting ready to get off of your shift and some customer comes in, sits down, and you go up and say, what? Hey sweetie, what do you need? Quick, 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 quick. Hey sweetie, what do you need? It's very staccato, and that has a meaning. The situation dictates that that's what the voice is going to sound like. Third one, suppose you are at a singles bar and you're a bartender there, the bartender, and somebody comes up and you're interested in that person and you say, hey sweetie, what do you need? Do you draw the words out a little bit more? Are they a little more guttural? Yeah, so it's not the word choice alone that's important when you're making a voicing product. You have to start paying attention to what kinds of meanings are involved with the pitches and the flows and the inflection that we use when we're projecting our voice as well. And you can practice that now. Okay, on the third one, saying, and I highly recommend, respect to Jean Kelly, she has a wonderful book called ASL to English. Say it like they mean it. Buy that book. You want to read that book. Anyway, okay. My first tip is to enrich your own vocabulary. We have 3 kinds of vocabulary. The average person has 3 categories. First is passive. Passive. We understand the word. We may not use it every day ourselves, but if we read it or we hear it, we're paying attention and somebody says it, we understand what it means. That's a passive group of words. Then we have an active, the words we use every day. Things people, when we're chatting with them, and it doesn't matter whether it's a high level or just chit-chatting with friends, these are the words we tend to use ourselves. Then we have the hot seat category of vocabulary. Which do you think of the 3 of these is the smallest group of words? Hot seat. How many times have you been trying to voice and there's like, you want to say the word, but you say the same word again and again and again? I'm often amused when in a class I will use the videotape by Angela Strady from Canada. her first clip, maybe you know it, I can't remember the name of the video right now, but her first clip talks about how to make the room smell nice. And she uses the sign, maybe 15 times in a 2-minute clip. And the voicers that are practicing and learning, later when they hear themselves, they're like, oh my goodness, couldn't I think of the word fragrance or aroma? But it never comes out of their mouth. That's in their working active vocabulary, but it just doesn't come out when we're on the hot seat. So when you're practicing, try to pull some of those active words into your hot seat vocab. Second tip on saying is to become really familiar with the meaning of the label idiomatic language. People hear that and they think, oh, you mean I have to say raining cats and dogs? No, we're not talking idioms. We just mean what is the natural way things are expressed in our language. So for example, if a presenter were to stand up and sign, you would not say gentlemen and ladies, even though he signed it in that order. Why not? Because you know, as a hearing person, we always say ladies and gentlemen. The women always come first in that phrase. That's how we use it. So your job here is not to follow everything the deaf person is signing. Your job, of course, in a good voicing product is to have something come out of your mouth that would make a hearing person in the audience who has no knowledge of the deaf experience comfortable to listen to the presentation. Now my third tip, and I love this one, I invented this game called Speaker in the Box. And I want you to go and buy, wait a minute, I'll show you what I want you to buy. One of these little things is like $9 at Walmart or something, and that's the box. So what you do is, you first get a videotape or a DVD with a signer that you understand. Then you hold that recorder. It's a recorder and it takes regular sized cassettes. You hold that and you make a voicing product. You probably feel it's pretty good because you've seen what they were signing. Okay. The way you play is, now you turn off the TV and go into a room that maybe has a mirror. I always use my bathroom. You put it down and you pretend this is not you in that box. It's a speaker, just some speaker. But you are going to do one of two things. If you have skill at lip syncing, matching, try lip syncing this speaker in the box. And stand there and just with natural gestures, like a hearing person talking to other hearing people in the audience, just lip sync what's going on. And you will snag every mistake you don't like in your voicing product. If there's dead air, you'll be talking a bit, and then I went to the hospital and I looked for the doctor. So anything in there when you're trying to lip sync it, you will catch it. If you have, you'll catch it as you're trying to copy your own product. The other thing, if you're not everyone is comfortable or skilled at lip syncing. So what you can do is interpret the speaker in the box. Put it down, start signing, watch yourself and think, if I had to be interpreting for a person that sounded like that, would it be smooth? If it's smooth, then you're well on your way to making a nice, to saying it like they mean it. But if there's anything odd, then go back and fix it. Play around with it until you get something you like. Now, I have to share with you that I believe that good careers are built small success on small success. Not many of us hit a home run every time we take the microphone or stand to voice. But if we practice it enough, we get a little, our confidence gets better and better. The problem is, oftentimes, we don't log our successes, but we obsess about our mistakes, right? Yeah. Okay, so if you will start a little success log, just write down every time you do something well, and don't stop this voicing practice until you've done it well. When you get a clip that you understand the person, make 5, 10 if you need to voicing products until it's something you're so proud of you would show somebody. Now, true, you're never going to have a chance to do that when you're really in the hot seat, but there's no reason you can't practice it and feel a little better, because everything you do will come back again someday. So you are not wasting your time by using this practice tip. My last general tip to help you improve your voicing is to tell you how I use a videotape or DVD for practice. You get the most use of anything like a DVD. First of all, make sure you get a hold of a video or DVD that has a voicer over the center. Plug it in, turn the volume down. Don't listen to the voicer. Watch that thing and watch that thing and watch that thing until you think you understand what the signer is signing. Then you pick up your little recorder and make the best voicing product you can based on what you understand the person to be signing. Put down the recorder, then turn up the volume and listen to the professional voicer. Was there anything you missed? Did they say something in a way that you never would have thought of? Did you do it in a way you thought was better than the professional voicer? That happens sometimes. So you can learn to analyze the product, not to make fun of the voicer, but to analyze the product, both yours and the one on top of the signer. When that's finished, then pick up your recorder again and voice another product and get it until where you like it. Then you can play speaker in the box if you like to. But before you give back that videotape or DVD, make sure you do one last thing, and this is really to help your expressive skill. But turn the volume down and then stand there and mimic everything the deaf signer is signing, and then your body gets to learn how it feels when you are signing in hot ASL. I'm getting ready now to show you a video clip of the delightful Peter Cook. He's granted me permission to use this clip to explain to you and to give you an example of how you might improve your voicing product. And this is just one practice tip, another practice tip. When I show you Peter coming on, the first thing you're going to see, there's a 45-minute clip, and 45-second clip, and then there's a 6-minute story. But the first thing you see is Peter signing, hello, hello, hello. You need to take out a paper and a pencil and write down, what would I say if I saw somebody coming out on stage signing? Would I say, hello, hello, hello? Because that's what he's signing. Would I say, hi, everybody? Would I say, hello? What would I do? There are many choices. So the tip is, for each part of the clip that you see, to write down, require yourself to write down 3 different ways you might voice it. So it takes pretty big paper or a board, and you make like little lanes. Okay, when I saw this, I might say these 3 ways. Next, he signed this. These are 3 different ways I could have said it. Next, and you go on. Later, you draw a little line. You think about, does that sound natural? Okay, there, I would start with this, and then maybe I'd take the 3rd choice on this, maybe the 2nd choice on this, and see if you can get a natural, idiomatic sounding voicing product. And the ultimate goal, pretending that there was no deaf person standing there at all that the product is coming from. It should be that smooth. So this little tip about forcing yourself to write down 3 ideas of how you might voice that will give you a better understanding of the choices you make, the choices you could be making, and it'll just help you to improve your voicing product. Next, what you're going to see is a clip of Peter doing an introduction, and then a 6-minute story. And I'm going to be voicing not his product, but making comments, analyzing what exactly he's doing, and just some thoughts about the decisions you might want, the thoughts you need to have as you're deciding how you're going to voice the product. Okay, what I want to do now is just walk you through some of the thoughts that go through the mind of a voicer and help you to make some decisions and give you some ideas about how you might phrase things for this introduction. He starts with, hello, hello, hello. So if you were playing that game that I was talking to you about before, forcing yourself to think of 3 different ways you'd be able to do this, maybe you'd start with that hello, hello, hello. It's not a bad thing. It seems to show his personality. But another thing you might do is hello, one big long held out hello. Or maybe hello everybody, something like that. So force yourself to think of 3 different choices. You can go back later and decide which one you like best. Now, he signs something here we don't really expect to see. He does, today what I'm going to do is a workshop, a presentation, and he signs the word plus. We're expecting to see and because that's how we think as English speakers, but it's very definitely plus on his mouth. Doesn't mean that you have to say plus though. You have to go for something idiomatic. So I thought maybe we would say, let me explain a little about what we're going to do today. We'll have a little bit of a presentation and a workshop. Or perhaps we'd say, today, we're going to have a combination, a presentation plus a workshop. Or a third idea might be, today, I plan that we'll have kind of a presentation and also a workshop at the same time, something like that. So you try 3 different ways that you think you might voice that. He's now given us a mouth morpheme, and he's talking about how large the number is. You have to think about how can you wrap some English around that. So maybe you might say, I want you all to be involved, or I'll be asking all of you to take part, or I hope you'll all feel free to join in. Now, he's telling us that, of course, be very difficult to get everybody up here on the stage, and that he's going to pick people out of the audience. So I came up with, but of course the stage isn't big enough for all of us to come up at the same time, so I'll pick some participants from the audience. That might be one way that you could say it. Or, I realize there are too many of us to all fit on the stage, so I'll grab some folks in the audience. Here you have to decide, what kind of speaker would Peter be if he were hearing and using his own voice? Do you want to use word choices like folks? Or do you want to take it up a notch, a register, and use the word participant? He looks like kind of a down-home guy, so you're probably going to want to go for a more friendly word choice here. At this point, he goes in that direct address, which, as I say, is a bane for all interpreters who are voicing. We understand this one. It's not as bad as when a deaf signer is having a conversation back and forth, but he goes into the direct address showing that the people can either raise their hand and he pretends he's somebody doing that, or they can sit there and just watch, and he performs that as a role. I decided to say it in English. I forced myself to think of a couple of different ways, and one of the things I came up with was, those of you who are eager to volunteer, just raise your hand, and maybe you'll be invited up. Or if you'd like to come up on stage, just raise your hand. Third choice on that first part, I came up with, some of you might want to come up. Just raise your hand and perhaps I'll pick you. Then for the second part of it, for the people who are not going to be coming up on stage or don't want to participate that way, I forced myself to think of 3 different ways, and I came up with, others of you might prefer just to observe where you are, and that's fine. Or a second choice, some of you don't want to come up, but would rather learn from where you are, and that's fine too. And my last choice here was, perhaps some of you would rather just watch. That's no problem. So you see, my point is that you don't have to go word for word telling me exactly, just because he signs fine, you can say something like, that's no problem, or that's okay. Your job as the voicer is to make it fall on the ears of the hearing consumer in such a way that they almost don't even know that a voicer is working. Now he says, we're going to mix it up and we're going to have some fun, and the goal is to play with language. There are a number of different ways you can do this, and as I say, once you establish what kind of personality and he has and what way you think he would be interacting with the audience, you want to keep your word register the same throughout. So I came up with some of the ideas. I'll mix up the activities and we'll have fun. We'll do a variety of activities and they'll all be fun. Or we'll change it up and we'll have fun. So those are 3 different ways you might say that. And again, trying to keep the word choice in the same personality arena. The next part, when he says the goal is to play with language, I came up with the whole point is to play with the language, or the main goal is to learn to play with the language, or the point of the workshop is to play with the language. These are just ideas that I came up with while I'm standing here watching him, but you can certainly come up with better ones, I'm sure. But the idea is to remember that you can get away from exactly what he's signing and use some of your active vocabulary instead of your hot seat vocabulary and just saying the sign you see. Okay, so he now gives you a list. Now this you can't be all that creative about. He tells you that he's definitely, the reason he became a poet, a storyteller, and an actor. You want to make sure you get all 3 of those in. Let me tell you now that if you're ever in a testing situation, or even in real life, if you're too far away to stop the signer, although you try never to be in that situation, you want to be able to make an intelligent generalization when you're voicing in case you missed some specifics. So if you missed a couple of those things that he became, of course in real life you're going to put your hand up and you're going to ask him to go back and list them. But if he's rifling off 5, 6 and you miss a couple, then you might say a generalization like, the reason I became a performer is that I love this language. So that's another trick you can learn as a voicer, is how to make a generalization that is not harmful to the product, is not invented, you know it's right on the mark, you just miss the specific things that he gave you on the list. At this point, he's taking a little break here, and he's saying, but before we begin this workshop, I know, according to deaf culture, I have to tell you about myself so that you'll be willing to listen to me. We always have to remember as we're voicing, to voice as he would voice. So he's informing the group, rather than saying according to deaf culture or it's part of deaf culture. He just wants to tell them, so you could say something like, so you could say, now before we begin the workshop, I must tell you about myself because that's a prerequisite in deaf culture. So he's almost kind of kidding. Maybe the people in the audience know that, maybe not. but he's kind of making a joke and also educating them at the same time. And he is here to educate them about deaf culture and about the language. So that's pretty much the beginning, the 45 seconds. And what we're going to do now, we're going to launch into the 6-minute story. So up until now, I've been giving you the idea of how it goes if you force yourself to say it 3 different ways, even if you can only think of one, force yourself, even if they're silly choices, just get your brain working. But from now on, I'm just going to be talking to you about things in what he's signing. I'm not going to be giving you any ideas about what you might say, but rather pointing out things to help you make a better voicing product. Okay. Now, I was hearing until I was 3 years old. Now he goes into that it happened that he became ill. And the choice here is, the idiomatic choice, what do you think the audience would expect to hear? Probably, he's going to say that he has spinal meningitis, had spinal meningitis. So probably you're going to use the word contracted or until I came down with. So you want to have those things in your bag ready to go. Now he's finger spelling spinal meningitis. He doesn't get the whole word out, spelled absolutely correctly, but because of what you know about deaf culture and the causes for people becoming deaf, you're going to be able to guess that even if you don't catch every letter. At which point he signs destroyed hearing. That's a real harsh word for us to say. Probably the audience, they may or may not accept that as an idiomatic use, but you can come up with some other ideas. It damaged my hearing. Start listening to people as they start talking and try and realize what it is that would be the most palatable word choice for you to make when he's talking about losing his hearing. You might even say, once I contracted spinal meningitis, I lost my hearing. Even though he signed destroyed, you can say, lost my hearing. At that point, he just gave you an editorial comment. He does the all over sign, it's the same all over with hearing parents, and then he makes a very slight shift and gives you what I call an editorial comment. He says, and my parents were hearing. He's about to tell you something about hearing parents in general, and then he says, and my parents were hearing. So just because he puts that editorial in there doesn't mean you need to say it. You might say something like, and as with all hearing parents who have a deaf child, my parents, and he's going to go on now to go into direct address. The next thing you're going to see, he's going into direct address, acting like his parents in a panic, not knowing what to do with a deaf child. Because he goes into direct address, you do not need to take on the character voice of his parents, like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? I think it's more appropriate here, it's in my opinion, to say something like, just as with all hearing parents who have deaf children, my parents didn't know what to do. Now, watch his face at that point. He's got that little look like they know something, but it's obviously a funny look that they didn't really know it after all. But he says, so they decided over there, he points over to the side. Next we see them going over to talk to this quote unquote expert, and you have to achieve that with your voice, with the inflection of your voice. So when you can't just out and out say, because the signs are showing, so they wanted to take me to a deaf expert, because everything on his body, the non-manuals are showing that he's making a joke about this. The person's not going to be an expert, and you have to accomplish that with your voice. So my parents decided to take me to a deaf expert, and just that pause and the way you say expert relays what he's done with his non-manual markers. It was a doctor, and he didn't know. If you just say, so they took me to the doctor and he didn't know, that's not going to work. what he's actually meaning in this message is he's not an expert. He doesn't know about deaf issues, and you have to give all that information. One of the tricks I use when I'm voicing is to pretend that I'm voicing for a deaf consumer, for a blind consumer in the audience who can't see the body language. So I want to accomplish with my voice exactly what he's doing, so that even if someone were blind, they'd get it just by my word choice and my intonation. Now he goes into direct address, and he does the stethoscope. And now watch his face here. He throws his chin up, and he sounds like he's proclaiming. So the doctor proclaims that for me to fit into the hearing world, and then he's about to give this piece of advice. So you have to make the doctor sound a little pompous when you are making this proclamation of what the doctor decided. So they send me to an oral school. Now he finger spells, and once again, if you're familiar with deaf culture, you know about Clark School as being an oral school. So as soon as he says oral, you start rifling in your brain through all the choices of all the places he might have gone. If you don't know any, do a little research, because this kind of information comes up all the time. You want to have some thoughts in your head about where he might be going with this finger spelling. Now he's about, what you're going to see next is he's using deaf humor. He's showing you this sign for Clark. This is very common with deaf people. They'll finger spell something and then show you the sign. Now he's going to make a joke about it. I don't voice the joke. Other voicers may choose to do so, but I think that it's funny enough just the way it is. I think if I went to explain it, it would take away from the power of what he's doing. So that was my school. Now he goes back into the story. Here's another structure that always trips voicers up. At first he says, and it looks like he's saying it's true, my school allowed sign, and then he says, no, it did not. So here's this rhetorical, it's almost a contrasting that he's saying they did, and then he's setting it up and saying, no, they didn't. Great reason to remember that you have to be behind the sign, or don't stay right on top of them, or these contrasting or rhetorical questions that are this way in nature are going to trip you up. They emphasize speech, speech reading. So I was there for about 9 years, and I have one story. He says, I was a good boy. Sign he has up. Sometimes we voice it as goody two-shoes. That's what I learned it as. But it just has the concept of someone who is not doing anything wrong. There are some situations in which you would voice it as holier than thou. I think I voiced for him once, I think I chose innocent. You play with it and see how many ways you can come up with to sign that concept, to say that concept. I followed the teacher. He's making a list. I always did what you wanted. Now, if you are having trouble at any point, he starts making a list. So he gets a little speedier. This man has lots of stuff on his mouth. So if you're just watching his hands, you want to start to widen what you're looking at and check out his mouth. He gives you a lot of stuff that he wants you to say. Some of his product is in strong ASL, some of it he's moving back and forth to English. When they start going quickly, or when someone deaf starts finger spelling things, whatever, see if you can get a clue from your mouth when you're voicing. Went to class on time. There's another good one. I had clean attendance. Now, if we say clean attendance, the hearing people, the hair is going to stand up on the back of their neck. That's just not a phrase we use. So instead there, you would substitute, I had perfect attendance, I had good attendance, something like that. Now, he's looking out at the audience and says, I see you're laughing. What? So in a little bit, you can put some humor, perhaps say, what, you don't think that's possible? knowing me now, you can add something that's not detracting from his message, and you're not giving him too much of a wise guy attitude. But he definitely is interacting with the audience there, so you want to say something about that and make it sound as though talking to the audience. Now, one day I got, and he does the thrown out of class. I think that's fine. You might decide to say tossed out of class. His head is going in an affirmation, so you know that this is going to be a story. Here's a rhetorical why. Now, I'm assuming most of you, if you're watching this video, realize you're not supposed to voice rhetorical questions. The most common way to get rid of rhetorical is to say because. That's what they teach in interpreter training programs. I got kicked out because, but he takes a long time to get around this. And the next thing you're going to see is him kind of stalling. He really doesn't want to tell, it looks like he doesn't want to tell you why he got kicked out. So using because may not be a solution here. You may still end up with a lot of dead air where you're saying nothing, waiting for him to get through this piece. So you could fill that dead space in with something like, yes, sure enough, I did get kicked out, no kidding. Or, maybe not that, but something to fill in that dead air without saying because. And he admits it's embarrassing, but I'll tell you, the reason I got thrown out was because I farted. Let's talk about filters here. There are some people who just don't want to say the word fart. We're taught as we're growing up that it's not that polite of a word, but trust me, saying pass gas is not going to be funny here. He definitely has on his mouth the word fart. If Peter chooses to use that word, then it's got to come out of your mouth. If you have trouble with that, if you go through, sometimes people have what I call a filter. Depending on your background, there are certain words you don't want to say, try and clean them up, but that's going to interfere with what he's trying to do here. He's trying to get the audience to laugh. Saying you passed gas is not going to make them laugh, so you've got to come out with that word, fart. Again, he's talking to the audience. I see you're shocked. And then he does the, you're so shocked your mouth fell open and I want you to close it. You don't really have to wrap any English around that. That's pretty obvious just through gestures what he's doing. Okay. So he goes out to the audience and he says, now wait a minute, he doesn't say wait a minute, but he sticks his hands up. And he wants a chance to explain. So you can do, now wait a minute, let me explain myself. A lot of different ways that you can handle that. Try and think of 3 different ways. My school is in New England, Massachusetts. Now, if it just comes out in New England, Massachusetts, it sounds like New England is the city in Massachusetts. So you've got to make some kind of break there. My school was in New England. It was in Massachusetts, or in the state of Massachusetts, something like that, so that you break it enough so it doesn't sound like New England is a town in Massachusetts. Okay. Now he's about to set up what we're having for lunch. Different items. So how it is you want to prepare for this. Now, he doesn't really say, on this day I ate, but you might be able to get away with it because he's telling a story about the day. The way I read it, I'm more thinking that he's saying, this is the kind of thing I tended to eat. We ate things like French onion soup. And then he's about to give you a list. But however you read it, you go ahead and voice it that way. There's the French onion soup, that's over. Next is baked beans, a whole pile of them. Now the thing you just saw, you can rewind your DVD to see this. He does this thing on the top that people think he's signing sugar, but clearly on his mouth, he's saying butter. I don't think it'd be a huge problem in the story one way or the other, whether you put sugar or butter on baked beans. But if you know about baked beans or you live up in Massachusetts, you probably know that's butter that they usually put on it. It could even be dropped out and probably wouldn't have a big impact on this, but as long as we're talking about best practice, again, here's a place where watching his mouth would help you. One other thing I want to ask you to think about here, he's going through 4 items and he lays them aside and then he pulls another one in and lays it aside when he's finished and pulls another one in. You really have to think about, how am I going to navigate that? Am I going to say, when I was finished with the French onion soup, next I had? I don't know. I don't think that would work. I think maybe a listing voice might work a little better here, just listing the kinds of things that he ate. All right? Now comes the famous Boston brown bread, which is baked in a circle, and it has raisins in it. Now, because I say it that way to you, I'm just telling you what he's signing. I wouldn't sign it that way. You have to come up with something a little more comfortable. So maybe you would say the famous Boston brown bread. I don't know if you know about this bread, but it's normally baked in like a coffee can shape, and it has raisins. So you might say raisins are peppered through it, or it had raisins all through it, or again, playing around with some ways that you might describe this brown bread. For dessert, chocolate pudding. Now, right there, when he makes that frowning look and stares out in the audience, this is another editorial comment. He's not saying he ate anything else. He's saying that all the things he ate were brown. So we'll watch him go through on this piece now. Yeah, it was interesting. Anyway, that kind of thing you really have to do with your voice. So if you said, I ate French onion soup, and then I ate baked beans, and then I ate brown bread, then I ate pudding, interesting, everything I ate was brown. It would really sound kind of, I don't know, I think kind of cheesy. So you want to make that last thing sound like the editorial comment that it is. So after you get through the things, at the end you say pudding, and then you say, that's interesting, they're all brown. Well, anyway, and going on with my story, so really do that inflection with your voice. Now, that sign he just did, the wide up by his nose, it often trips people up. They think it's the sign silly, but it is not silly. It goes round and around in a circle near the nose, and it's wow. That's the meaning of it is wow or oh my goodness. So you have to decide which one or a third one. Now his stomach's having a party. Okay, so the thing you're seeing him do now, he's trying to hold it all in. There's a whole lot of ways you could say that. You should have some fun trying to find some words to say that he's trying to keep this gas inside of his body so it won't come out. Now, he's walking up to the audience when he's going down the hall and his stomach is having a party. And then he walks straight back and he's about to tell you something. He left the story up there. That's like a pause. He's going to go back to that story later. It's just a pause. This is a sideline he's about to tell you so that you'll understand the story better. He does that by walking back. My teacher, her name was Miss Rainey, and how about that little thumb on the head thing? I remember her. I don't think it's strong enough. I'm thinking something like I'll never forget her. Play with some ideas about that. And what you're about to see now is normal word strict, and he's going to play with it. And you've got to think about, how am I going to say she was more than strict, she was some other word? Or how are you going to get around this playing that she was more than strict? Terrible. And here's a description. She had, how are you going to describe? There's a great classifier on those eyeglasses. You probably had a teacher like that maybe, and the bun on her head. But just saying she had eyeglasses and a bun, but I bet you can come up with something creative for that description. Yes. Now we know when we see this, she's hearing and she's talking, but you have to find a way to describe that. I didn't understand, but I understood what it meant. But I understood what it meant. So then we see him going into character, sitting down, looking up at her, and once again talking about how intimidating she was. So as you're doing this, if you can't think of a good way to phrase it, start thinking about synonyms for strict or austere. And then from there, you can jump off into some different ideas on how to phrase this. Now he wants to tell you something about the classroom. Here's one of those contrasting structures again. He tells you how these tables were set up and then tells you no, they weren't set up that way. They were set up in a horseshoe so that the children could see one another. Now, he's doing some description. If you know some, at this point, if you know some labels that equipment was called, you got to take a look at Peter. At this point, I'm thinking he's his late 30s when he was doing this piece, maybe. And if you know historically what kinds of equipment and what they were called back then, you could pull it in here. If not, then you just go for, and here he might just be saying, we all had headphones on. Now he's talking about the dial in the front of the desk that everything gets connected to. Now, that was a ceiling with a microphone hanging down. Now, how do you say that? Are you going to say the deaf voice? We already know it's a room full of deaf children, so we don't have to do, so the deaf voices went up there. We've already established that it's a bunch of deaf kids, so you can just lock that part out and say, so as the children spoke, their voices went up into the microphone in the ceiling, and now he has them over in a box with a dial, a gauge, that gives power. What is that called? We want amplifier, or something like that to be coming out of your mouth, rather than, that went over to a box with a gauge. So it made the children's earphones be activated in such a way that they could hear one another better, something like that. Also remember that you're going to assume, even though he happens to be talking here to ASL students, your assumption as the voicer, unless you know better, is that no one in the hearing audience understands anything about deaf culture. So you have to, like, for instance, if he was to come out with NAD, you don't just say, so I went to a meeting of NAD. If you're with a bunch of hearing people, that acronym would mean nothing to them, so you would have to fill in the National Association of the Deaf. So now we're back in the story, and you can tell because he's taking on the role and he's going right back into the funny thing that he did before about trying to hold the gas inside. Right before he does this part, coming out, he does the go-ahead sign, the two hands near the chest, and he pushes them forward. Yeah, how are you going to say that? So finally, I let it out, I let it go, I let it rip. Make yourself think of a bunch of different ways. It's probably not something that comes up in your conversation that often, but start listening to how people talk about that particular thing that happens in life, and then you'll have some more choices. Now, here's the funny thing that he's trying to show you. He has the tables jumping, and then he shows you up on the wall things falling off, and we can only assume they're books falling off. Now he's showing the noise going, here's why we need to know grounded mental space. What's up on the ceiling? It's the microphone. Once he starts pointing over there, you realize he set up the wire from the microphone over to the amplifier, so now we know where he's going with this noise. As soon as he goes up, we have to remember what he put there, which was the microphone, and know where he's going with this story. So the dial goes up, pow. How are you going to describe that? You know, it goes up as high as it can. You've got to think of some ways. At that point, because it's up that high and the earphones blast in the kid's head, he's now going out of their chair because the noise was so loud. And you know that's what it is because he goes in that horseshoe of where the kids were set up. Then he looks out at the audience and he says, so you know what we did? We played this game. Right away, you're thinking in your head, do I know this game from my deaf orientation class? Do I know anybody who was raised in residential school? Did I ever hear this story? Some of you may, some of you may not. By the end of this story, you'll know it. But first he wants to make a connection with his hearing audience. And he just wants to run by some games that people do. And he's about to say, and your brain has to be able to go there. The last you knew, he was telling about the story that he played after he passed gas in math class, but now he's trying to build some rapport with the audience, so he's asking them, how about this game? Do you know this game? And he does Volkswagen Bug. And then he asks him, what do you do when you see a Volkswagen Bug? And he says, you punch. Yeah, punch buggy. If you know punch buggy is the word that goes with that, he just does the punch. If you didn't know it, then you would say, yeah, people tend to punch each other when they see a Volkswagen Bug. Or if you have a little phrase that's cute, like punch buggy, then you could put it in there. Now, hearing people, if they're chatting and they say the same word at the same time, they smack each other and they say the word jinx. Now, it doesn't work with deaf. He has set up the deaf group of people on his left and the hearing people on his right. So when he starts pointing over there, you have to remember that's where he put the deaf people, and he's about to tell you that that jinx thing doesn't work because the deaf people don't say the same word at the same time because they don't talk. But he asks again, do you know that game, you guys out there? We don't do that in the deaf world, the jinx thing, because they don't talk. So that game is no good. He puts out the NG. You don't have to say the game is no good. You can simply say, so that game doesn't work in the deaf world. Something like that. But I'm going to tell you what happens in deaf culture. And he's about to share a piece of information. And you see just the way his body goes back and he starts sticking his little finger out. It's almost like this cute little thing he's going to share with you that deaf kids do. If you fart in a room, then he goes out to ask the audience again. One person guesses, you say, excuse me. And he says no. Now, he's not really saying you don't say, excuse me, because excuse me is an okay answer. But you might voice for him, that's not the answer I'm looking for. Sure enough, he gets somebody who gives him this. At this point, I have to tell you, if you ever work with Peter Cook, you're a lucky voicer because he tells you about this. Most interpreters right there would say father. But if you say father at that point, you just ruined the whole point of his story. If you're going to do your pre-work when you're talking to somebody deaf, ask them, is there anything coming up that you do or don't want me to say so that it does or does not ruin your story? He will have told you, please don't say father when I put my hand up. So now you have to go for the description. Yes, they put their hand up on their head with a 5. Something like that would have worked. Or they spread their hand out and put their thumb on their head. You have to have some kind of description other than the word father. So he asked, do you remember that game? Then he says to them, we're going to practice. Come on, guys, put your hand up like this. He starts looking at the audience, and he looks at one person and says, that's the last person who did it, so we're going to blame them. Now, blame them for what? If you have that extra information, then you say, we're going to blame them for farting. It just makes it more clear. Okay, so that's our game. Now we're back in the story, and he nicely tells you we're back in math class. He begins to repeat this action that he's done before so that he can get some more mileage out of this. I don't think I voiced this part, but you might. Kind of try to remember what you had said, kind of say the same thing, and at this point we take off to, and the children all began to stick their hands up on their heads. And he's about to tell you what the teacher's doing. How are you going to describe that? Even though he's got his hand up in the air, what could you say? My teacher, who was writing on the board, something like that, heard all this, and when she turned around, she smelled all of it. Now there's another editorial comment. He throws in that it's all boys in the classroom. You have to decide, are you going to mention it? If you are, can you get it in there in such an idiomatic way that it's seamless? Maybe something like, you might expect this from a classroom full of boys, or something, I don't know, or maybe just leave it go. And it doesn't have a big impact on the story. So she sprays some kind of air freshener. Now she puts that air freshener down. She's looking mighty angry. You have to recognize he's in the teacher's character here. She's looking mighty angry. How are you going to say that? She got angry at us, or she began to reprimand us, or she was so displeased that, and then we go on with the next thing she does. She sends them all to the principal's office now. Now that's kind of the end of the story. When he says the why, that matches the first why he had when he was about to tell you the story. And he says, why? I got thrown out of class. Why? Well, it's really a little embarrassing. So now we're seeing the story come full circle, and you know you're at the end of the story, and he says, why? And here comes the punchline. We put our hands on our heads, and that's the sign for Father. Remember, my school doesn't allow signing. And I got thrown out of class. So you have to make your voice come down near the end to show this is the end of the story. You have to know this is an ending signal. You might say something like, he's responding to the audience here. He's doing, I see you're all shocked by this, which is probably not a good ending for these stories, but you might say something like, yep, sure enough, that's a true story. So as long as you're not going too far off of his, as long as you're not going too far off of what he's saying, your job is to make sure you say this story in some kind of a way that a hearing person who doesn't know anything about that culture would be able to understand and appreciate the story and not feel uncomfortable. Well, there you have Peter Cook's 6-minute story, and we have walked through it. You can use it now to practice voicing product yourself, and don't give up until you like what you did. I think one of the worst mistakes that we make is that we do it and think, oh, I've seen that video or DVD already, I'll use a new one, and we never achieve proficiency at what we're working on. Language recycles itself. Anything you spend time doing now, you will benefit from in the future. So I encourage you to not only stick with it until you really like the product you have, but then write it down in a success log to know that you can cross that one off, you have that done. So thank you for spending time with me. Thank you again to Peter Cook for his kindness in allowing me to use his clip, and I hope to see you in another DVD.